Screwed by Canada.
But Trump's anger at the trading relationship goes way back. One of the earliest beefs of his first term over Canada's dairy industry.
Going up to 400%. You never hear that. Canada's absolutely one of the worst.
It all began with numbers 270%, then 300%. Next came 400%. For President Donald Trump, these weren't just figures. They were proof that Canada was strangling American farmers with excessively high dairy import tariffs. And by the end of August 2025, those tensions flared up more fiercely than ever. In an unexpected move, Trump announced he was halting all trade negotiations with Ottawa. He accused Canada's dairy system and digital taxes of being clear evidence that the United States was still being taken advantage of. Across the headlines, his hard-hitting words dominated, giving the impression that a new storm was brewing in bilateral relations. But looking deeper, the story was never just about milk or a handful of tariffs. It is a broader confrontation between two visions of economic sovereignty and how each country seeks to defend its own interests. The ones bearing the brunt are not the leaders, but the dairy farmers on both sides of the border, struggling to calculate how to survive in an increasingly unpredictable trade war. Representatives. Canada has been ripping us off for years. 250% tariff, which has taken advantage of our farmers. Donald Trump's fixation with Canada's dairy industry is nothing new, and it certainly did not begin in 2025. As early as his first term, he repeatedly and publicly criticized the supply management system, calling it a disgrace, while forcing Ottawa to concede 3.6% market access during the renegotiation rounds of the USMCA in 2018. But for Trump, that was still far too little. By 2020, and again throughout the 2024 presidential campaign, he continued to hammer away at the issue. His argument centered on what he described as sky-high tariffs, 270%, 298%, even 400%. Technically, those figures do exist within Canada's tariff schedule, but they only apply once imports exceed tariff rate quotas, the upper limits of goods allowed in duty-free. In reality, most of those quotas are rarely ever filled. Data from Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs show that the majority of U.S. dairy imports, such as yogurt, cheese, and butter, remain well below the permitted thresholds. For example, in 2024, Canada allowed a quota of 3.5 million kilogallons of yogurt duty-free. Yet importers only used about 12% of that amount. Still, for Trump, such details mattered little. In his view, the entire Canadian supply management system, where prices are controlled and farmers' incomes are guaranteed, stood as a symbol of the very model he wanted to dismantle at its core. Well, the uncertainty is killing us, and it's hurting American business, sort of Canadian business. Even before Donald Trump announced the end of trade talks on August 27th, the pressure weighing on farmers in both countries was already clear and growing more severe. In the United States, dairy producers who rely heavily on the Canadian market, which accounts for nearly 40% of all North American dairy exports, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, began to see buyers pulling back as the outlook grew uncertain. Raw milk prices dropped by $1.70 per 100 pounds, pushing many farms into losses. Inventories piled up in cold storage. An emergency federal relief package of $85 million US covered only about 7% of the estimated total damage. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers faced a different kind of hardship. The supply management system shielded them from direct price shocks, but trade flow disruptions caused serious export bottlenecks. Processing plants were forced to scale back, particularly on high-volume products like ultra-filtered milk. Ottawa quickly announced a federal relief package worth 6.5 billion Canadian dollars. Still, for many rural communities dependent on dairy, the money barely made a dent. Analysts estimate that the combined losses from production disruptions on both sides of the border have already surpassed 1.2 billion US, with no sign of slowing down. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed. For the Canadian government, the supply management system is a principle that cannot be bargained away. In several recent interviews, ministers close to the Prime Minister stressed that Ottawa had already made concessions under the USMCA, and it would not retreat any further, especially under pressure. Donald Trump, however, chose to escalate the tension to a new level. This time, he tied the dairy issue to national security, invoking fentanyl and border control as justification for imposing new tariffs. The Canadian government immediately rejected this argument, pointing to close cooperation in law enforcement and the RCMP's role in compliance. The provinces, despite their varying degrees of autonomy, also moved in step with Ottawa to respond. British Columbia imposed a new levy on U.S. commercial trucks. Ontario considered raising electricity surcharges by 25%. Even Alberta, often skeptical of federal regulations, joined the ranks of resistance. The collective message was crystal clear. Canada will not trade its dairy sector for metals or energy. According to statistics, Canada dairy products account for only about 0.1% of total bilateral trade. Yet, their political weight far exceeds that number. For Trump, it is a lever to highlight unfairness in trade deals. For Mark Carney, it is identity and the backbone of rural life. For farmers, dairy is not a symbol. It is a daily livelihood. Trump may believe tariffs are the right answer. But for thousands of families in Wisconsin, Quebec, and Alberta, this amounts to nothing less than a looming disaster. If leaders fail to find a way forward, the next casualty of this trade war will not just be statistics. It will be the trust between the two nations.
A major development tonight in Canada-U.S. trade talks. Late this evening, the federal government suddenly announcing it is now rescinding its tax targeting big tech companies. The Prime Minister saying talks can now resume.
Days. Well, in the statement, the Prime Minister says this announcement supports a resumption of negotiations.
After weeks of warnings, stalled negotiations, and steadily mounting tensions, Ottawa abruptly reversed course, scrapping a tax that had pushed relations with Washington to the brink of crisis. Only hours later, the White House signaled its readiness to return to the negotiating table. On the surface, the move looked like a diplomatic victory, but behind the scenes, it was in fact a test of power, pressure, and political resolve. Trump may have been forced into a temporary concession. Yet the larger question remains, what does he intend next? On Sunday evening, as the deadline for the tax to take effect drew near, Canada announced its cancellation. Finance Minister Francis Philip Champagne confirmed the government would repeal the digital services tax and was preparing legislation to formally end the policy. Why did Canada do this? The main reason was to pave the way for restarting negotiations on a comprehensive and mutually beneficial trade agreement. The timing of the announcement was no accident. The 3% digital services tax aimed at American tech giants such as Google, Meta, and Amazon had been debated for years. It was also retroactive to 2022, with the first payment from U.S. companies alone, amounting to 2.7 billion Canadian dollars scheduled for collection on August the 1st. Yet, as the deadline loomed, Trump's threat landed like a heavy blow. He warned that if the tax was not withdrawn, negotiations would be over, and new tariffs starting at 25% on all Canadian exports would immediately be imposed. Faced with the prospect of severe economic retaliation, Ottawa was forced to step back. And it wasn't only Trump's pressure. Domestic business groups, including the Business Council of Canada and the Chamber of Commerce, also urged the government to reconsider, arguing that the policy threatened the investment climate and the long-term stability of bilateral trade. The result was that after months of insisting it would hold firm, Canada yielded. A carefully calculated retreat carried out quietly, but one that can hardly be denied. And Trump thinks he holds all the cards. I'm not sure that's true, but US is in a powerful position vis-a-vis Canada. 80% of our exports go to United States. Unknown, but I suspect that as part of this tough negotiation, and bluster even from Trump, we will see a higher than expected tariff rate indicated to us. In the eyes of many, the recent move looked like a swift victory for Trump. He drew a clear line, and Canada was forced to yield. Yet experts are asking, is this the end or merely the beginning? After all, the digital services tax was never Trump's only concern. For years, he has relentlessly attacked Canada's supply management system for dairy, eggs, and poultry. Beyond that, Trump has also targeted barriers in telecommunications, the banking sector, and what he calls non-tariff trade weapons. These issues have long been noted in U.S. trade reports dating back to the Clinton administration. But Trump is the first in decades to bundle them together and wield them as a comprehensive pressure package. According to Ian Lee, a Canadian business scholar, what Trump really wants is straightforward. Every sector must be placed on the negotiating table. So far, Ottawa has firmly excluded core areas. Agriculture has been kept off the table. Telecommunications have been kept off the table. The digital tax as well. Now at least one of those three has been brought back into play. From this perspective, Canada's reversal on the tax is not an ending, but rather a signal. Trump's tactics appear to be working, and he is far from finished with the game. The mouse and the elephant. We're the mouse. They're the 5-ton elephant. So, I'm not saying we lie down on the carpet, but and give up. I'm saying we go to them and say, look, we'll put everything on the table. Both governments now claim they are working toward a new agreement with the goal of finalizing it by August 21st, 2025. But the road ahead is certain to be fraught with obstacles. Trump continues to stand by his warnings of additional tariffs, including an August 9th deadline for a round of retaliatory measures targeting dozens of countries. Without progress, those tariffs could escalate into a massive burden. On Canada's side, the economy remains heavily dependent on the U.S. market, which absorbs nearly 80% of its total exports, according to 2024 trade data from the U.S. Department of Commerce. That very dependence has given Washington a significant advantage, and Trump knows it well. Thus, even though the digital services tax has been withdrawn, the deeper layers of the trade confrontation are far from resolved. Trump has shaken the status quo and secured the concession he wanted. But with a series of ever-increasing demands still ahead, the pressing questions remain. Who will pay the price, and who will be the next casualty in this spiral of tension? If we don't make a deal with Canada, we're going to put a big tariff on cars, could be a 50 or 100%, because we don't want their cars. Critical. I love the idea. Or the aspiration of a Canadian car. At the beginning of 2025, Donald Trump stepped up to the podium and declared, "Every car sold on American soil must be built in America." And this time, he did not stop at slogans. First came tariffs on steel, then on aluminium, and then a 25% tariff directly on finished vehicles imported from Canada. The message was unmistakable. Washington no longer had patience for the cross-bear production model. But this was not simply about policy. It was about pressure. And its consequences are now unfolding daily, not only for Canada, but also for American automakers. The Trump administration calls it a restructuring strategy. Yet for many manufacturers, it feels like an economic shock. Companies had spent decades building a tightly knit cross-bear supply chain. With a single decision, all those connections suddenly became liabilities. North America's auto sector was designed as an integrated system where each component was completed in stages, often crossing the US-C border multiple times before becoming part of a finished vehicle. A piston might begin as aluminium mined in Quebec, cast in Ontario, processed in Detroit, and finally fitted into an engine in Windsor. By the time the car rolls off the line, that part may have crossed the border 5 or 6 times. This was never wasteful, but rather the result of specialization. Canada handled casting, stamping, and mass production. The US focused on software, electronics, and final assembly. That partnership allowed Ford, GM, and Stellantis to cut costs, minimize delays, and scale up output. The coordination rested on a foundation of policy stability from the 1965 Auto Act to NAFTA, and more recently, the USMCA. If this chain is broken, the consequences will be more than higher costs. Detroit's global standing itself will be at risk. That balance is now under strain, and the message from Washington is clear. We want to build cars in America. We no longer want to import them from Canada. We want to make our own cars. We don't really want cars from Canada. We put tariffs on cars from Canada, and at a certain point, it won't make economic sense for Canada to build those cars. The 25% tariff Trump imposed on cars imported from Canada, combined with the 50% duty on Canadian steel, has upended the entire production equation. Since July 2025, Ford and Stellantis have been forced to shut down certain lines in Ontario as costs surged and consumer demand fell sharply. In Windsor, Stellantis' plant is now running only on rotating ships. Meanwhile, General Motors has ramped up truck production in Fort Wayne, Indiana, while shifting part of its Oshawa production back to the United States. These are not isolated decisions, but signs of a wider tremor shaking the entire industry. The U.S. auto sector is now bearing heavy consequences. Stellantis alone reported losses of $5 billion US tied to tariffs in the most recent quarter, according to an internal report obtained by Bloomberg. Ford offered a similar estimate. Canada's auto parts industry, which supplies nearly half of the output for U.S. plants, is now facing vanishing orders, and the impact is not confined to steel and automobiles. Trump's hardline trade policy has also spread to mold-making and specialized equipment sectors long dominated by Canadian firms. Several suppliers in Ontario said they had lost long-term contracts with U.S. customers, not because of price, but due to concerns over prolonged instability. At the same time, the American auto industry is facing indirect fallout in labor relations. UAW union leaders in Michigan have warned that rapid shifts in production strategies driven by political volatility could unravel recently negotiated labor agreements and disrupt plant modernization plans. And all these developments are only the beginning. President Trump actually gave Canada a gift. It's really the first time that Canada or Canadians are looking back and saying, how did we allow ourselves to get into the vulnerable position that we are in? Trump doesn't need to actually impose a 100% tariff. The mere threat alone has been enough to paralyze investment flows in Canada, disrupt cross-border logistics, and sow anxiety in corporate boardrooms. But the core issue lies elsewhere. As automakers gradually withdraw from Canada, it does not mean the United States automatically benefits. Rather than expanding domestic production, many companies are downsizing, shifting lines to Mexico, or even deciding against further investment altogether. In this context, Canada has also warned of retaliatory measures set for July 21st, potentially targeting U.S. vehicle exports directly. This places Detroit at risk of losing its second largest international market. Trump may have scored a political win, but at the same time, he is undermining the foundations of a 100 billion Canadian dollar industrial ecosystem, one the United States can hardly protect on its own if its closest partner is pushed into decline.